Good morning, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We have a few announcements as everyone joins. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees, and we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It does look like we're getting ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Zachary to begin.
All right, thank you, Mary, very much. So welcome to this really important session, the interrelationships between invasive plants and fire management. My name is Zachary Prusak, a fire training specialist with Tall Timbers Research Station, and I am going to hand this off to our first speaker, Michele Crist, landscape ecologist with BLM Fire and Aviation, and she'll be talking about altered fire regimes and invasives. So Michele, it's all, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just start this. Okay, so my talk today is on altered fire regimes and invasive species. And in this talk, I'm going to show some preliminary results on emerging wildfire trends in our shrubland grassland desert ecosystems due to the large-scale spread of invasive grasses. I will also touch on potential management strategies for these ecosystems. So nationally, acres burned in fire suppression costs have increased roughly 5 times from 1985 to 2017. And while state and federal agencies pay the bulk of the suppression costs, and these costs only comprise 9% of total wildfire costs, the total annualized cost can range from 71 to 347 billion and includes loss of infrastructure, loss of private property, construction costs, emergency evacuation, loss of ecosystem services, and post-fire recovery efforts. So one area of particular concern is in sagebrush ecosystems across the West, where current wildfire trends have changed significantly over the past 2 decades. This map shows different sagebrush communities in green. And for the fire perimeters, dark red are fires that have burned in sagebrush, and orange are fires that have burned in other vegetation types, primarily forested areas. And just over the past 20 years, over 17 million acres of sagebrush have burned, primarily in the Great Basin, portions of Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. We are now seeing large fire sizes of 100,000 to over 400,000 acres that are becoming common, and we've seen an increase in fire spread and extreme fire behavior. So historically, fire cycles were highly variable across the sagebrush biome. And the fire return intervals could vary from several decades in our colder, moisture, higher elevations to hundreds of years in hotter, drier, lower elevations. And this had a strong influence on sagebrush landscape structure and just really helped to create the large, expansive areas that were dominated by dense sagebrush. Our contemporary fire cycles have substantially changed from historic trends. In the hotter and drier, lower elevations, return intervals are much shorter and don't allow time for full recovery of sagebrush. And this is due to non-native fire-prone grasses that invade these sagebrush ecosystems and provide contiguous fine fields that ignite easily, increasing fire occurrence and spread. And in the post-fire environment, cheatgrass rapidly recovers, outcompeting natives, while native species like sagebrush don't recover and eventually just disappear across the landscape. And the result is high rates of conversion of sagebrush to non-native annual grassland communities that continue to spread across landscapes and promote frequent fire, sort of this positive feedback loop. So the figure on the left was actually developed by Jones et al. In 2019. And it depicts how the distribution and cover of annual invasive grasses have increased from 1990 to 2018 due to warmer temperatures and changing weather patterns. And the invasive spread and interaction with fire have created these large expanses of monocultures of cheatgrass that we see today. So the figure on the right represents the change in the proportion of shrubland and grassland over a 100-year period. And the picture on the top was taken in 1901. And the picture in the middle was taken in the same spot in 2008 and is now a cheatgrass monoculture. And the graph at the bottom shows the proportion of shrubland versus grassland over the past 12,000 years and how much that proportion has changed since European settlement, shown on the right side of the graph. So the graphics shown here are just used to illustrate that the Great Basin is the largest area with the highest fire probability across the United States. High fire probability is shown in brown, yellow represents more moderate, and green represents lower burn probability. And these high fire probabilities in the Great Basin correlate really well with the occurrence of the invasive annual grasses. There are also other non-native grasses that alter fire regimes and native plant communities. These non-native grasses were mainly introduced for grazing purposes back in the early to mid 1900s, and they continue to expand across the West and alter fire cycles in native forested, shrubland, grassland, and desert ecosystems. These grasses are seeing increased fire cycles where native plants and grasses cannot recover and are outcompeted by invasive grasses. And they include African wiregrass, medusa head, red brome, bufflegrass, and South African layman lovegrass. So because of the increase in wildfire in sagebrush ecosystems, I was interested in calculating recent wildfire trends for both non-forested and forested ecosystems to gain an understanding of these recent fire cycles for non-forested ecosystem and how these trends may differ from forested ecosystems, especially where fire regimes have been strongly influenced by invasive grasses. And so below are 3 objectives and methods for the study. So the first objective was to sum and compare area burned in non-forested and forested ecosystems across the United States over the past 2 decades. And a time series GIS analysis was conducted using GeoMag fire perimeters from 2000 to 2020 and corresponding land fire data sets to compare area burned for all non-forested and forested vegetation types across the contiguous US. The second objective was to analyze wildfire area and configuration patterns using landscape metrics across 11 Western states. And here, FragStat software was used to compute 26 landscape metrics that calculate statistics on the area and configuration of forested and non-forested burn patches annually over the past 2 decades, using the derived burned area geospatial datasets above. And lastly, the third objective was to compare current wildfire intervals to historic intervals to determine where areas may have departed fire cycles. So fire regime departure was produced by calculating the ratio between current large fire probability geospatial data set that was produced by Short et al. In 2016, and the historic mean fire return interval point estimates for each vegetation community type from land fire. And this was done across the US. So results for the first objective for comparing total acres burned across all ownerships for the US. Non-forested vegetation types are burning more or as much as forested types. And this trend has continued over the past 2 decades. For total area burned across all land ownerships, 56% of burned area is in shrubland grassland communities, whereas 44% were in tree-dominated communities. And this trend is shown in the graph on the right, is especially pronounced for Department of Interior lands, where 72% of acres burned are shrubland, grassland, and desert ecosystems. So these results have implications for current federal policies related to fire that mainly focus on forest fuel reductions. And here, new policies are needed to help address shrubland grasslands where they are burning uncharacteristically. We also need a stronger management efforts in protecting these native non-forested ecosystems where they are at risk from wildfire. So for the second objective, I quantified wildfire landscape patterns across the Western US. And results of the 3 area-related metrics that are shown in the graphs below show that over the past 2 decades, non-forested areas are experiencing trends of an increase in area burned, higher number of burn patches, and larger fire sizes when compared to forest area burned. And these results were surprising, given that many of these non-forested vegetation types experienced fire relatively infrequently. For area burned, non-forested areas are burning more than forested areas, but increasing trends over the past 2 decades have been relatively similar. The trend for number of patches burned is increasing for both non-forested and forested types, and it is increasing at a higher rate for non-forested patches when compared to forested patches burned. And results for area-weighted mean burn patches indicate that the trend for large fires have been increasing over time, with non-forested burn patches being slightly larger than forest burn patches overall. And results for landscape metrics that quantify the configuration of wildfires for the Western US show that the non-forested burn patches have changed over the past 2 decades. And so the metric percentage of like adjacencies, which is at the top left, indicates that for both non-forested and forested wildfires, a large percentage of the area burned within the fire perimeters are largely dominated by either non-forest or forested vegetation types. And this trend has not really changed over time, despite the increase in size of large burn patches. The interspersion and juxtaposition index at the top right indicate that burned non-forest and forest patches are increasingly becoming more interspersed among each other over time. So these results indicate that the configuration of the burn patches are occurring and changing among different geographic regions and are not always located within the same region annually. And the area-weighted mean nearest burned patch neighbor indicates that wildfires in non-forested types have become more widely distributed over time, whereas an opposite trend is occurring for forested burn patches, so it's decreasing. This suggests that forest burn patches are potentially becoming more clustered in certain geographic regions annually. Overall, these metrics indicate a new trend of a larger distribution of non-forested wildfires across the West. And for the third objective, this map here depicts fire regime departure across the West. And here results depict areas that are shown in yellow that are slightly high to red, very high, which are areas that are currently experiencing too much fire. And the areas shown in green, which are a slightly low deficit of fire, and dark blue is a very low deficit of fire. So here, just using GIS overlays, I selected vegetation communities from land fire that have the potential for too much fire and ranked them by area to produce this graph on the right. And so overall, 74% of the area experiencing too much fire are non-forested communities. And while it's hard to see here, the top 5 vegetation communities are the Big Basin sagebrush shrubland steppe, introduced annual grasses, desert scrub, salt desert scrub, and pinyon juniper woodlands. In addition, this fire regime departure is shown here with a smaller map of invasive annual grasses across the Great Basin. And these graphics just visually illustrate that the surplus of fire in the Great Basin correlates well with invasive grasses presence. And so traditionally, wildland fire management has typically focused on areas with a fire deficit. And now there is a need to address contemporary wildfire trends of too much fire in non-forested ecosystems where traditional methods for fuels management will really not address this problem. There are also many subsequent impacts and management challenges for these new trends of altered fire regimes in non-forested ecosystems, especially for sagebrush. And these include increased risk to human life and property, high fire management costs, and loss of cultural and economic resources. In addition, many wildlife population declines are occurring due to habitat loss and fragmentation. There are also a number of challenges in wildfire management. And one of the biggest is that we have a culture that's focused on forest fires. So, for example, our current policies on forest fuel reductions do not address the large percentage of frequent fires caused by invasive grasses, especially in the heavily invaded shrub and grassland communities. In addition, the public's understanding of fire is that past fire suppression resulted in the fires they see today. They are not aware of other causes of uncharacteristic fires, especially fires influenced by invasives. In addition, the media focuses on fires that are occurring in forested areas, which drives public perception on wildfire and wildland fire management. We also need to address human ignitions. Human ignitions can range from 31 to 97% of wildfire starts, depending on a location. And a lot of our wildfire research has really largely focused on forested lands. There are some new opportunities and tools that can help address wildland fire for non-forested ecosystems. Here, wildland fire risk is mapped at a broad scale to distinguish between vegetation communities at risk to fire and their capacity to recover from fire and resist annual grass invasions. We can use this information to prioritize areas for wildfire management and then determine the most appropriate types of actions for wildfire suppression operations, fire prevention strategies, vegetation and fuels management, and post-fire recovery. And lastly, there are some other opportunities for reducing this wildfire and invasive cycle. We need more integration across state, tribal, and federal invasive programs and wildfire management programs. We need to elevate the issue of non-native invasive annual grasses and wildfire across agencies, increase coordination for targeted prevention, control, and eradication of invasive grasses, develop new management strategies based on ecosystem resilience to fire and resistance to invasives, increase firefighting capacity in rural areas, fund research on the topics of invasives and wildfire management, and ensure that post-fire recovery efforts create resilience to fire and resistance to invasives. And lastly, we just need a stronger collaboration between state, tribal, and federal wildfire prevention programs. And here we need to focus education and prevention programs in areas prone to human-caused fires. And with that, I will just say thank you very much. And I'm not sure that we have any time for questions, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was a really great presentation. We have about 1 minute, and I'm looking in the Q&A. I don't see any questions in there, but I would like to applaud your mention of perception of the starts of fires, because I think that we, the whole social aspect of everything, marketing fires, and how the public perceives how fires start. I think the connection with invasives and fire has just it doesn't reach that part, which I think is a huge need. I appreciate you saying that.
Yes, well, thank you. I completely agree.
We have a quick question. Great talk. Are any of these data published?
They are in the process of being written up right now. So what I have shown are some preliminary results, but yes, I have 2 papers in the works.
Awesome. Well, again, Michelle, thank you so much for that great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Lindy Garner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Lindy will, her talk will focus on invasive management and how that relates to limiting fuel to wildland fire. So Lindy, if you're up, take it away.
Okay, so our producer was going to run my recording. I did this as a recording. Here we go. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss invasive species management integrated with your efforts to reduce wildland fire risk. We have an exciting opportunity to enhance our collaborative efforts with targeting our management to slow the spread of invasion and limit fuel to wildland fire. As Michele just provided in the previous talk, and most of you know that the West, and particularly the sagebrush ecosystem, is under significant threat of annual grass invasion and wildland fires. These invasive annual grasses are highly flammable fuel that result in more frequent and larger fires across our western rangelands. This conversion from the spread of the invasive wildfire cycle in the sagebrush ecosystem has significant impacts that we see in the news, from increased risk to human life and property that affects communities and their infrastructure, to livelihoods being affected from loss of production and high fire management costs, to things less noticeable but happening nonetheless, like loss of economic and cultural resources and destroyed habitat of the over 350 wildlife species dependent on sagebrush. So let's take a look at the extent of this invasion problem. That's fuel to the fires with the core scale representation. This data layer was produced by the Interagency Invasive Subcommittee through the Western Governors Association. Currently, invasive annual grasses have already spread over 100 million acres across the West, from mild to heavily invaded areas, while we still have over 200 million acres that are relatively uninvaded, yet they are at risk if we do not get ahead of the spread and the transition. The green areas are still primarily intact perennial plant communities, providing opportunities for prevention and early detection and rapid response to maintain these intact areas. The yellow and orange areas are where aggressive management is needed to reduce the spread of invasives and prevent these areas of fine fuels from degrading further and transitioning to a heavily invaded state. The red areas are already heavily invaded, in need of containment to prevent spread, and they are most at risk for wildfire, requiring a concentration of resources for rapid wildfire response. If invasive annual grasses continue to spread at their current rate, and we do not appropriately manage this issue, these areas will continue to degrade and convert into invasive annual grasslands with an amplified wildfire risk, adding to the already overwhelming management burden of other areas. The fire and invasive species issue has been worked on from many different angles. These are policies, secretarial orders, and legislation, federal, state, and local partnerships, communication efforts, stewardship agreements, monitoring collaboration, and a multitude of publications on planning and guidance, data tools, science, etc. The Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies queried and explored to find over 500 organizations involved in sagebrush conservation, and that recognized the critical issue with invasive annual grasses and their tie to the wildland fire cycle. While all these efforts are significant, the invasive side of this fire and invasives problem tends to be less directed in natural resource management and not defined as a programmatic priority, and with less resources allocated. Unfortunately, we also still have invasives and wildfire management divisions still working separately in many places, rather than integrating their efforts, with invasive species experts and integrating technical invasive species information, right along with the other side of the fire community and fire technical information, so that together, and from both the invasives and fire perspective, we can address this problem. This special session at the Congress, along with others, and efforts like the National Invasive Species Council and the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, coordinating with each other, are stepping up communication and looking for opportunities to increase coordination and leveraging operations for the greatest chance of success and prevent new invaded areas from wildland fire risk coming online. The planning and science that we already have is a strong baseline of information that can be used together as we integrate invasive and wildfire science. We must work together across groups, bureaus, across agencies, so that we can effectively move from planning to shared implementation and utilize the information for developing shared operational priorities of where to implement
more early aggressive invasive treatments as fuel suppression to truly move the needle on successfully addressing both the invasive and wildland fire threat. And we can more effectively design operations to implement treatments based on a reminder of invasion ecology core concepts. As a conservation community, we often wait too long to address resource concerns, deferring management until problems are obvious with a big impact and very costly. We can visualize this with a quick reminder of the invasion curve seen here on the left. As an invasion starts, it is small with minimal impact and low cost to treat by being proactive with eradication and aggressive management. But as the invasion spreads and becomes larger over time, then the impact is worse and cost of treatment is high, and now significant management burden over the long term that is less likely to be successfully restored without extensive resources. And we know landscape context matters. For example, the figure on the right shows two scenarios. Blue is uninvaded and red is infested. In the one on the left, we are managing small invasions in an otherwise intact landscape, while in the one on the right, we are trying to save small, uninfested islands in a sea of invasion. Obviously, we are going to be more cost-effective and successful in the less invaded landscape on the left. So if invasions occur, they should be addressed as early as possible, when still cost-effective, and before a threshold is reached where perpetual management is needed to contain the invasion, or it will become a wildfire risk and requiring more extensive associated costs. So a movement's grown for more implementation of these core concepts with the Defend and Grow the Core while Mitigating Impacts model, as represented here from the Department of Ag's Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Western Governors Association Cheatgrass Toolkit. This model is a roadmap for developing shared priorities for where to place implementation on the landscape that meaningfully addresses the large-scale infestation of invasive species and significant wildfire risk on western rangelands. And to do this, we need to first defend the cores of the intact habitat from invasion and anchor our management efforts to these cores with cost-effective preventative care to reduce the chance of getting invaded. Then grow the core with early and aggressive cost-effective invasive species management by pushing back the leading edge of invasion and reverse the transition zone from invading intact core areas and grow the core rather than regional spread. And finally, while we recognize the importance of proactive management of intact areas, we've got to continue to acknowledge that continued management of other lands will be needed. And so the third element is to continue to mitigate the most severe impacts of the invasive fire cycle with management in those areas most invaded and most threatened for life and property and requiring costly emergency care. So to evolve this approach to include the Defend and Grow the Core model, we can also look at the existing challenges and opportunities for implementation. The first challenge is that invasive species management is often not recognized enough as a high priority for management, and therefore often it does not get the attention and subsequent resources it needs. In the sagebrush ecosystem, invasive annual grasses are the fine fuels to wildland fires, so we need to recognize the importance of addressing the invasive annual grass problem earlier. The opportunity to do so is by raising awareness. The sagebrush ecosystem invasives and fire issue is not recognized as a national invasive species issue, like Asian carp or pythons in the east or mussels in the northwest. Yet it is associated with just as significant impacts from the extensive degradation and the tie to massive wildfire issue that covers 13 western states. We need invasive annual grass management to get more attention as a priority at all levels and to unlock the expectation of addressing them only in heavily invaded areas, when that is really too late. We need to recognize prevention and aggressive invasive species management is needed pre-fire just as much as post-fire, and leverage that idea with additional partnerships across both the invasives and wildfire arenas for more implementation on the ground. Supporting invasives management with leadership and Bureau accountability for invasives programmatic priorities, then interdisciplinary management planning can be integrated and aligned with Defend and Grow the Core approach that translates into partnership operations that can be successful to slow the spread of invasives and prevent new wildfire risk areas. The second challenge is that the varied priorities across the ecosystem, due to the complex landscape of invasive species management authorities and operations. We have an opportunity to develop shared priorities for where to work on the landscape by identifying priority resources of concern and integrating defend and grow the core approach while mitigating impacts. There's an opportunity to integrate invasives and wildfire information within high priority areas for management based on many factors, from state or federal wildlife species of concern to protection of communities, energy and cultural resources, to understanding how and where climate change impacts may assist or negate our management investment. There are previous templates of how to do this through examples like the fire and invasive assessment teams and the wildfire risk mitigation pilot. Our stewardship partnerships can leverage opportunities based in mandates and aligned with the latest science information to identify common denominators for shared priorities for where to work on the landscape. And we can build on the extensive collaboration established and take it even further for when it matters, of putting work on the ground for invasives management and wildfire response. Finally, resources and capacity are limited, but we have to recognize the Western wildfire problem is not only or primarily forest fire suppression and fuels management, but there is also a significant need for addressing rangeland fires, much less early invasive annual grass management. Subsequently, if we are addressing invasive annual grass management, it is often directed mainly to those areas highly invaded, such as the red and orange areas on the map. And rightly so, these areas need attention to mitigate wildfires. But notice how much of the ecosystem is not red. Yet, it will be if we don't protect these other areas from further invasion. The invasion ecology core concepts provide science-based justification to implement more actions to protect the intact areas and light to moderately invaded green and yellow areas from turning into the highly degraded red sites with amplified fire risk. While we will never have enough resources, we can more cost-effectively utilize available funding by leveraging our efforts with partners for conducting both invasive annual grass management pre-fire along with fuel suppression and post-fire rehabilitation, and be aligned with the defend and grow the core model with more implementation strategically placed on the ground in shared high priority areas. As we move forward, the success of our actions are dependent on continuing our collaborative conservation from regional to local levels that implement spatially prioritized operations of cost-effective management strategies that are supported and justified by science and target high priority core areas through landscape partnerships. So in summary, this challenge is urgent and boils down to requiring us to invest in implementing more pre-fire invasive species management actions before these areas become too degraded, resulting in greater high fire risk that requires more fire suppression resources. We must maintain our momentum and continue to work with partners in priority areas where you have a good chance of success for increasing perennial grasses while reducing these invasive annuals with science-based methods, and work together to find resources and capacity to increase monitoring so that we can demonstrate success and identify lessons learned. The Sagebrush ecosystem is primed for conserving and restoring additional lands and waters with the America the Beautiful initiative. It requires shared planning and applying climate adaptation principles and tools for decision-making of where to invest for a durable, resilient sagebrush ecosystem, while it also provides rural and underserved communities a significant opportunity for leveraging job creation and utilizing the Civilian Climate Corps for work in fuel suppression and post-fire restoration, but also for early, cost-effective invasive species management pre-fire that maintains intact, high-priority core areas. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Lindy. Another great presentation. So yes, we have a couple questions before our next speaker. So Amy in the Q&A box asks, why aren't these invasive grasses recognized at the national level like carp?
That's the $1,000,000 question. And we've talked a lot about, from a collaboration standpoint, just the messaging aspect of, and Michelle mentioned it too, really getting the public to understand that connection. A lot of it also is, in many areas, it is out of sight, out of mind kind of concept happening. But that is what we're working diligently on across the ecosystem with several partners to try to address that. And I do want to mention, while the principles presented here were within that context of a sagebrush case study, if you will, but obviously, of course, these principles could be applied, to other areas from that invasion standpoint and from that same aspect of trying to address the fuel prior to it becoming a significant problem. So.
Thanks, Lindy. Great question, Amy. And I'll, so just a couple more. So, and I liked the fact, Lindy, that you mentioned that it often isn't a priority in many organizations to be proactive, to put time and effort into invasive, corralling them. And I've seen it in several agencies here in Florida where the state may not invest in more staff, even though the land acquired for the public is increasing. And yet there doesn't seem to be, and it's a politically fraught subject sometimes. It's like, well, we can't add more quote unquote government workers. But I think it's that penny wise, or it's not efficient. You should invest in people to do this work.
Right. And actually, I'll mention that while the federal agencies often might not have enough funding either, or staff or capacity, the states are even in a bigger hardship. We work closely with our Western State Weed coordinators trying to address that also. And, the states are limited oftentimes by only being able to use their state funding for listed noxious weeds. And some of these invasive annual grasses and some of these other species that drive wildfire may not be listed as a noxious weed. And by law, they may be limited to be able to use their funds for that. And so that's where it's so important locally and regionally then to work with partners and try to identify additional funds or other ways to try to leverage some of those operations on these types of problems above and beyond. But trying to assist and help our state partners is a huge piece of this, as well as the private landowners, because that's where the state partners can then sometimes come in and help as well. So it's a big issue from that standpoint.
There's no doubt. And I did one quick closing point. I did love the fact that you mentioned the CCC as this construct to perhaps provide employment. We fooled with these fire teams in the Southeast that basically were geared toward fire, but they also did invasive work. So full-time people devoted to working across boundaries, private, public, to do invasive detection when the burning days weren't great, and then do fire. And that worked pretty well, and it was not very expensive to do. So I'm not sure if there's any way to, push any of this giant funding we see coming toward more proactive CCC type teams to do invasives and fire.
Absolutely. That's exciting to hear that it was working and being done.
All right. Well, Lindy, thanks again for your presentation. Much appreciated. All right. So now we will move on to our next speaker, Garrett Dickman, a botanist with the Yosemite National Park. And his presentation will focus on the effects of suppression tactics on invasive plants. And so, Garrett, if you're ready and you're queued up to go, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you. Let me cue this up. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here virtually or in your homes. So Garrett Dickman, I'm a botanist and a resource advisor at Yosemite National Park. A botanist you probably know, and some of you may know resource advisor. And that's sort of the side hustle that I have working with incident management teams to reduce the impacts of suppression on the landscape. And that could be anything from archaeological sites to invasive plants to protecting rare wildlife. So we're going to go through kind of some nuts and bolts of what it looks like to fight fire on the landscape and how this influences invasive plants. So starting off here with a map, and like any good map, you have a river, I've got a community on it, a road, and all my maps typically have weeds or invasive plants on that. So we're going to run through a little scenario here where we've got this community and a fire starts on, a foxfire, as we're calling it. And to protect the community, fire management starts putting a dozer line around the community. And that's represented by these little X's, which if you look at a fire map, that's usually what you see, X's for dozer line. And the fire starts to spread a little bit. Jump the river, and the fire management team starts putting down fire retardant, aerial applications of fire retardant next to that road. They connect the dozer line in with the road, and they connect it in with the fire retardant, lay down a little bit more fire retardant, put in a hand line by those H's there, and they catch the fire. So the foxfire has been caught. It is that outline in red there, and you can see the suppression impacts on the map from the hand line, dozer line, and the fire retardant. They also use the road to help stop the fire. So we'll look at those impact types, and we've got a couple that happen. Those direct impact types, that is fire burned vegetation, and we need to think about that from an invasive plant standpoint. But I'm mostly going to be talking about operational impacts. What happens when you put a bulldozer on the landscape? How do invasive plants respond to that? So again, those direct impacts, vegetation burns, things change, provide opportunity for invasive plants. So you're probably well aware, many invasive plants are early colonizers, and fire is a form of some disturbance or just changes the resource availability. And in this instance, we've got yellow spiny plant was able to overtake the purple triangle plant because it is after a disturbance like fire, it's just a little bit more competitive. And other people are talking more about this, and I'm going to focus more on the operational side of things, but just keep that one in mind. So those operational impacts are those impacts that occur during the management of a fire. And those are things like line construction, hand crews. You could have a 20-person hand crew, and you might have 5 hand crews going through a single area. So that could be 100 people walking through a single area with various hand tools. The application of retardant and foam. Sometimes it's from the air and sometimes from the ground. Mop-up activities. Those are usually after the fire's gone through on the edge. Firefighters are trying to keep that fire from reigniting and jumping across the line. So they bring in water, or they use tools and stir up the ground. Times there's a lot of driving off-road that occurs during the fire. Sometimes that's within the fire perimeter and sometimes outside of it. There are almost always staging areas or drop points where there's large congregations of fire apparatus and equipment. Tankers, bulldozers, lowboys, everybody meets up there in the morning. So you have these big parking lots that appear in the middle of nowhere. Helospots. These could be predetermined helospots or helospots that are cut into the land where they remove a bunch of trees and they bring in a helicopter. Fire camps. These can be anything from a 20-person crew that's spiked out in the wilderness, or it could be 6,000 firefighters with showers, laundry, and sleeping units. And then burnout operations. This is sometimes to fill in the gaps, to create black on the land and connect the fire between the suppression line and the main fire's edge. Firefighters will bring fire down through that to connect it, and that's called a burnout. So these are kind of the main types of operational impacts that we might expect to see during the management of a fire. And in all of these, disturbance plus vector, like a fire engine, can equal invasive plant spread, or at least that's an assumption that I'll be looking at a little bit more. So kind of looking at, this in particular, here's a picture of a bulldozer about to bulldoze a line in, and it's about to plow over bull thistle, a non-native invasive plant in my area, and it looks like that plant's about to go to seed. So what happens when that bulldozer bowls over that pre-existing population of invasive plants? It very likely could spread it. What about this hand crew that's passing through? 20 people, 100 people with hands? How are they moving invasive plants around? What about this large air tanker, or a very large air tanker in this case, a VLAT that's dropping fire retardant? Is that dropping, and has there a potential there to drop invasive plants? I'll look at that one just slightly more. Fire retardant is largely a kind of like a fertilizer plus dye and attack of fire that helps it stick to plants and therefore retard the fire's growth. We looked at a fire in a volcanic substrate and dropped fire retardant from the air, and that picture on the top is cheatgrass, an annual invasive grass, 1 year after that fire retardant, and then the picture below is 2 years after the application of that fire retardant. And we were able to map where that fire retardant had been dropped based on the growth of that cheatgrass. You could literally see it on the landscape in the response of the vegetation. Of the annual vegetation, we didn't see any impacts or changes to the perennial vegetation. We also noticed that there was increased seed, and we might assume that the seed viability may also be better, but we don't know. But we did see that the plants were larger and they had more seed on them than those plants adjacent to that area where fire retardant was dropped. Another thing we often think about are invasive plants at base camps, spike camps, and hellispots. These are points of congregation, and people start there. They could be bringing invasive plants in with them, or if there's already pre-existing invasive plant populations, they could be spreading them. And having gone to many base camps, they very often have invasive plant populations already there. And in both of these, think about the equipment and the people as vectors that have the potential to further spread any invasive plant population. Notably, one of our worst infestations that have occurred after a fire is from the helibase, where a helicopter brought in a non-native invasive grass medusa head that was talked about in the last talk, and they brought it in, it established at their helibase, and we think it's gone many places in the park after that. So this does happen. So kind of going to dive into where to look for invasive plants after the fire, because one way to know how big these impacts potentially are is to look after the fact to see where the invasive plants show up. So I'm going to go through a couple ways of how to survey, what to look for, and then go through real world examples that we've done in Yosemite. So again, talked about those direct impacts. And if you're going to only look at those direct impacts, you might want to survey based on the burn severity, maybe focus on those high severity patches or moderate, check the assumptions that whether invasive plants were there and if they spread. But that kind of gets at this disturbance idea, but not necessarily the vector idea. So with thinking about the vector and the disturbance, looking at the operational impacts. On a small fire, you might want to survey everything. But on larger fires, suggest looking at the operational impacts and known infestations. So that'd be ICP, that's Incident Command Post, or the base camp, spike camps, helibases, and the dozer lines, the communities, hand lines, the roads that were used as lines. Might want to look at those areas where there was fire retardant that was applied in case there was an existing population of invasive plants that increased post-fire. And any known populations of invasive plants, because there might be an opportunity for them to spread, even if they weren't spread by the operational impacts. You also might want to look at some of the sensitive habitat, like riparian areas or around areas of where there's rare species. So I'm looking at this, taking those concepts and looking at some early detection rapid response that we've done in Yosemite National Park, looking at 9 different fires, from anywhere from 400 acres to the Brim Fire, which was our biggest fire in the park at just shy of 257,000 acres. That at the time was a very big fire, but that has since been eclipsed by other much bigger fires. And we looked at about 14 miles of retardant, almost 50 miles of dozer line, 100 miles of hand line, 45 miles of roads as line, 72 miles of mixed line, where some of it was hand line, some of it was dozer line, some of it was road, and then a variety of safety zones, hell spots, and spike camps. So what this map is, or this graph is on the bottom, we've got those various impacts, hand lines, dozer line, drop points, etc. And then on the y-axis, those are the gross number of acres of invasive plants per acre of disturbance. So what I've done is averaged all those out. So if, these are not absolute numbers, these are averaged numbers. And a gross infested acre is, if you were to take a look at a population of invasive plants and put a circle around it, that's your gross acre. The net acre is if you were to push all those invasive plants into one corner and then basically kind of the area that's covered by the drip line or basal area. So this is kind of looking at more of the population. If the number is above 1 or near 1, that means that the impact or the population increased greater than the actual impact. So if you had 1 acre of hand line and you had 1.5 acres of invasive plants, that means the population increased in size. And we did try to, and pulling these numbers together, remove those pre-existing populations that were there prior to the fire. So these numbers mostly represent the post-fire invasive plant population. So kind of looking at generally the hand lines, dozer lines, drop points, and roads all had sizable increases in the invasive plant populations for looking at a gross perspective. Safety zones, those kind of mixed lines, camps, hellespots, and areas where retardant were used had a much less invasive plant growth post-fire. Looking at the net area of invasive plants per acre of disturbance, again, the net area is the area that is, if you smush all the plants into one corner and count up the actual area of that those plants covered, that's your net area. And we see pretty similar results where the drop points, completed lines, which increased a little bit, hand lines and dozer lines, those are all had quite a bit of net and acres of invasive plants post-disturbance. And less so in the safety zones, the roads lines, the camps, the hell spots, and almost nothing for retardant application. In this one, we're looking at the number of new non-native species per acre disturbance post-fire, and that is how many novel infestations were there. We have a pretty good understanding of where our invasive plants are. Where were there new invasive plants post-fire? And what we found were notably in camp and drop point, for every acre of new camp we had 2 new species that showed up in the park, and those were either novel species to the park, novel for the watershed, or certainly not pre-existing. And drop points 1.5. The hell spot, though only didn't have as many, it still had one of the worst invasive plants that we have in the park showed up at the hell spot. And less so for dozer lines, hand lines, almost nothing for retardant zones, safety zones, or roads as line and completed line. And some of those other points, especially dozer lines and hand lines, there are mitigation measures that are in best management practice that are put in place that may help reduce those numbers. Equipment is supposed to show up to an incident clean. They're supposed to clean it before it shows up an incident, and then at the end of the incident, that equipment is washed, and that may explain why those numbers are less for new non-native species being introduced. However, in the previous slide, those dozer lines did significantly, may have pushed pre-existing populations that were already here in the park. So boiling that down into kind of a simpler way to look at it, when you want to look at an area post-fire, what sort of impacts should you really be focusing on? And I've broken this down by fire size and then the disturbance across the top there. So camps, heliphots, drop points, known populations burn, dozer lines, hand lines, those areas of high severity and rare species habitat. So if in smaller fires, 1,000 acres or under, you might want to consider looking at all those potential areas that were impacted, because they're relatively small. The risk of having an invasive plant novel infestation establishing is probably high enough that all those areas should really be looked at. At some point, it's less feasible to walk around the entirety of the fire, and you might want to prioritize those areas where you have where it's feasible to walk around and look at those suppression impacts. And I would focus on the camps, hellspots, drop points, those known populations that burn because they're potentially increase, the dozer lines and hand lines. And as that fire increases another order of magnitude up to 100,000 acres, I would consider maybe not surveying all the hand lines, because it doesn't seem, while there is potential for those to get invasive plants, it seems smaller than some of the others. And at the 1,000,000 acres, I'd prioritize the camps, hellspots, drop points, those known populations burn, and the dozer lines. Though this year in the Dixie fire, I believe there was 2,000 miles of dozer line that were put in, and so that may not be feasible either. So some of the take homes from all of this, typically kind of what you expect. People are the largest vector for new invasive plant introductions, and that was seeing drop points, camps, and hellspots. Kind of didn't dive into the details of it, but camps are often situated in heavily infested areas. I've gone to many camps that have horrified me. They're sometimes at fairgrounds, sometimes they're in an agricultural field, and you'd always be amazed what you find out there. They also can act as a point of introduction. And so if there's invasive plants there now, after the fire personnel have gone through it, there's great potential for those invasive plants to spread. And what I've seen with retardant is it may pulse the existing populations. There might be an increase there, but it may not, it's not really much of a vector in its own right. Dozer lines, hand lines, roads spread existing invasive plants, though there are good prevention measures in place for a lot of those that might reduce the risk of a novel infestation, especially shockingly around dozers. They really do try to keep those clean before going to a fire. So they should be inspected, but the risk for spreading them around is maybe not as high as you might think. And roads often seem to have the least disturbance of any fire line. They're also the easiest to survey and treat. So I will recommend, preparing roads or any sort of as a fuel break is a good way to maybe reduce invasive plant populations from being introduced throughout your land. So some further tidbits there. Before the fires, it's important to have all your data ready to be able to hand it off to an incident management team. And that includes any sensitive areas or invasive plants that you want avoided. If they don't have data in hand, they can't do anything to prevent impacts. Have best management practices that we can give them the incident management team, and there are lots of them that are readily available. And then I recommend preparing roads as fuel breaks. During the fires,
Garrett, I'm afraid you've got just like about 30 more seconds.
Okay, that's all I got. Resource advisors will attempt to steer those impacts around infestations as they're on the ground people, help them prioritize the top concerns, and then recommend ordering a weed wash for the incident command post. And then after the fires, I highly recommend an early detection and rapid response program, and then prioritize that based on the risk of those invasive plants and the reality of being able to get those surveys and treatments done. And that wraps it up for me. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Garrett. Really great information there. And so real quick, we had a link. Matt Bauer in the chat put in the Western IPM Center has funded work in California focused on how fire management activities affect invasive species spread. So that link is in the chat. And so great. So if anybody wants to get in touch with Garrett, I'm sure they can. So now we will move on to Matthew Germino. And I know, Matt, you were asking about testing your mic. Well, we're going to do it right now. So Matthew Germino, research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and his talk will focus on the management of annual grasses in recently burned areas. And so, Matt, it's all you.
Great. How's my mic working?
It works great. So, yeah, perfect.
Sometimes it sounds like the chipmunks.
Oh, well, that's a bonus.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen. Okay, is that coming through?
Not quite yet.
Nope.
Still not there? Okay.
We can see your screen. There we go. We can see management of annual grasses slide
Great,
there.
thank you. So forever to break the grass fire cycle, we've really got to focus on how we are managing burned areas after the fire. And our team of postdocs and master's level technicians have been working on this problem for a collective number of years, that is many decades actually. This includes plant ecologists, physiologists, and soil specialists. And our focus is on preventing burned areas, specifically in sagebrush steppe, but more broadly to many of the different types of upland semi-arid landscapes, which are mostly rangelands, so they're mostly grazed, from having these community type conversions towards annual grasses that are burning at a frequency which is much beyond the adaptive capacity of most native plants. So to help us focus in on this, I've created this little cartoon. And again, the bias here is towards sagebrush steppe landscapes that our team works in most frequently. But the general principles are applicable to many other upland types, whether or not the woody species present are shrubs or trees. So typically you've got a diverse mix of native shrubs, bare soil patches with biological crusts, and herbaceous species, some native annuals, but typically native perennials, grasses, and sometimes forbs. Annual grasses invade the interspaces, especially where improper grazing practices have depleted the perennial herbs. And we set the stage for wildfires. I know you know this already. What we hope for is after the fire, the site still has some resistance and resilience that's conferred by the resprouting perennial herbs. So if they're resilient to stresses and disturbances like fire and perhaps drought that often accompanies fire, and that drought that persists often in the first few years after fire, then we can have resistance to annual grass invasion and stay in this cycle with fires happening every 50 to 100 or preferably 300 years in some of our semi-arid uplands that are vulnerable to annual grass invasions. And what we're trying to avoid, obviously, is these sites becoming more invaded instead of staying in a cycle and having so much cheatgrass that we get locked into this repeated high frequency pattern of excess burning that excludes our perennials. So the question is, we already know that post-fire management can help us stay in the desired cycle and out of the undesired cycle. But the question is, how can we do it right? Clearly, we've not had the kind of success in managing these transitions that we need. And that's evident in the amount of lands that have been converted undesirably from these types of landscapes that you can see here from this nice photograph from Steve Hanser that shows all the desirable elements. Bare soil that helps moderate fire behavior, covered with biological crusts, deep-rooted perennials that stay green for longer into the year, and some diversity, provides a lot of ecosystem services and avoids all of the unwanted liabilities of excess fire. So there's diversity in that native ecosystem and the biological diversity that we need to think about when we're managing these burned areas, because the tools that we use are pretty well dialed into the specific biological properties of the species that we're managing. So this is a plant management problem. Diversity of invaders is another issue that we need to think about. Historically, the focus was on cheatgrass, but more and more we're seeing medusa head coming into areas that were previously invaded by cheatgrass or new areas. And the third wave has species like ventinata. And these species transitions are problematic because these subsequent invaders are more ecologically deleterious than and impactful than cheatgrass. They have more silica, they decompose more slowly, they're less palatable, they're less desirable. We see analogies to this in our warmer deserts, like in Mojave, where red bromes and schismus have entered the equation. There's perennial bunch grasses, perennial grasses in even warmer deserts, such as buffalo grass, that are highly problematic. And there's smooth bromes that are at the high elevations everywhere that are also causing problems. So I just want to recognize the diversity that, what we want to see and what we don't want to see. Now let's talk about management. So the first question is to intervene or not to intervene. And many managers recognize that interventions, they carry a risk, and oftentimes those risks have resulted in the deterioration of sites, so a net negative impact. If we do intervene, and we will, the question is where and when. And you already know about the resistance resilience concept that Dr. Gene Chambers, Dave Pike, and a collection of many other longtime restorationists have developed to help us figure out which burned areas should we allocate our precious resources to, and then within the very large burned areas, where within those landscapes might we have the most impact with our investments. This is really critical. So, resistance to invasion. Again, the focus here is on exotic annual grasses because they impact fire more than some of the other invaders. Those other invaders include exotic forbs, like knapweeds are one example, tumble mustards. Some of them can contribute to fuel loads, but nothing like the fire impacts that annual grasses have. So resistance to annual grasses, and then resilience of the native plants to recover. And the theory, the concepts tell us that, number one, even somewhat narrow vegetation types like sagebrush steppe actually are very diverse in terms of the types of conditions they grow on. Wide range of climate, soils, and pre-fire conditions such as grazing practices that affect the abundance of resprouting perennial herbs that are so critical for competing with annual grasses. So the concept here is that at very low elevations where it's warmer and drier and droughtier, the landscape may have already been negatively affected by grazing, and there's probably such low resistance that you're unlikely to see desirable outcomes without excessive investments. And conversely, at the very highest elevations, the more amenable growing conditions, cooler, wetter, confer greater resilience. And so interventions aren't needed. So that middle zone of moderate resistance and resilience can both oftentimes benefit and exhibit positive outcomes from our restoration interventions in terms of post-fire management. So I want to acknowledge that. Now let's talk a little bit more about the details of what the management can be. By far, the most common intervention is grazing management. Typically in the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies, this is a nominal 2 years of rest. And what are we hoping for? We're hoping that the perennial herbs, specifically often the perennial bunch grasses, are relieved from grazing pressures, allowing those perennials to rebound a little bit better and have at least some ability to possibly compete with the annual grasses. Now that's great in concept, but the reality is we are lacking the basic information to guide the decision-making on grazing rest. I think you all probably recognize that a nominal 2 years of rest may be more than is needed in some areas, some pastures, and far from enough in others. But the problem is we're lacking information to help managers know how to prescribe the rest. We need to know what can we measure readily over the huge areas that are being managed. Pastures that range from 1,000 to 10,000 to sometimes 100,000 acres. That's the scale at which the individual grazing management decisions happen. But we don't have a good way of first of all, knowing when are the herbs mature enough and what can we measure to know that? And even if we did know it, there's a lot of rigidity still in the way that grazing permits and grazing decisions are structured. And that's an administrative thing that needs to be dealt with. And I know that the BLM is working towards flexibility. Livestock operators are important components of these landscapes. And when they lose access to $1.50 per animal unit month forage, and instead are paying 30 to 100 times more than that, the financial impacts can sometimes be deleterious to them and knock out their operations. That's a reality. The other thing is that once, so after the fire, you've got a lot of bare soil, and then by years 3 or 4, typically most areas will be pretty grassy. And that grass is, it's wildfire fuel accumulation. Where that begins to become a problem, some managers are looking at grazing as ways to manage that fuel. This is an ongoing area of research. We need more research on this particular topic to know if this is a viable tool and how it should be dealt with. I just wanted to acknowledge it. So clearly there's some problems here. If we can address these, I think it's important to recognize that we will potentially have a huge impact because so much of the area is grazed. And this little cartoon here just acknowledges that there is research underway to help us eventually get the information needed to fill these gaps. Now on to active restoration. This is what most of us think about for post-fire management. Pulling out the tools, herbicides to reduce exotic annuals, and seedings to increase the desired perennials. Oftentimes, these are combined with soil surface treatments such as harrowing or dragging chains across the landscape to bury seeds and break up crusts, physical crusts. Now, this active restoration is typically, like on the Bureau of Land Management, handled by the BLM's Emergency Stabilization and Rehabilitation Program. And historically, these interventions the managers had 21 days after a fire was suppressed to come up with a plan, a proposal for funding, and then they would, if they got the funding, they might have a year to invest the funding, and they might monitor out to 3 years to some degree. That's changing a little bit. There's a little bit more time afforded to these managers to do these projects, but what I'm pointing to is this historic problem of the one-time single entry investment, which is problematic because if you think about this, we're trying to farm the desert and the challenges are numerous. Not only is there low amounts of precipitation is highly variable from year to year. I mentioned already that fire happens in dry phases of drought cycles. Those dry phases oftentimes persist in the years following fire when we might be trying to get seeds to grow. So with herbicides, we're worried about the specificity of the herbicide. Non-target effects are concerned. One way that we can get non-target effects is when the herbicides, which tend to be pre-emergent, so we're trying to knock out the requirement of annuals to germinate every year, allowing perennials to resprout. So pre-emergents attack the seeds. And when those herbicides are on soils, if soils are bare, we're seeing wind erosion, an increasing problem because a lot of our burned area is occurring in huge patches. And that drift of herbicide off-site is not only a problem for the site we're managing, but also for downwind areas like crop fields or cities. And so public sentiment is a real issue here. Also, the longevity of herbicides is a major challenge. I'll talk about that in a minute. Seed selection, seeding is also problematic. We're still learning a lot about the adaptive biology of the major species that are seeded. We're not quite there yet, but we do have some preliminary seed transfer guidelines to use for some, but not all species. Even if we know what seeds to use, supply demand of seed is always a problem. There's just not a lot of people out there that collect and grow or grow seed for restoration in the types of habitats that we need to manage. And then even if you get the seed in the ground, you're lucky to get it germinated and established. So historically, active restoration has been very challenging. There's many examples of limited success, and it's not surprising. But I want to point out that I think the literature will support this, that our skill in restoration is improving every year. And the past, in my opinion, is not a great prediction of future success in terms of restoration. Now, how extensive are these? Well, we can turn to the Land Treatment Digital Library, which is a critical resource for enabling adaptive management at the scale of the entire Western US, in my opinion. Number of treatments in this database on the BLM alone, you can see more than 15,000 seeding treatments, almost 10,000 herbicide treatments, lots of acreage treated, okay? But if you start drilling into these individual projects, looking at them, we realize that documentation of where the treatments have happened is not as good as we might hope. It's getting better every year for sure. And similarly, we don't always know the outcome of these treatments. That makes it hard to learn, to do the adaptive management, to fill these data gaps that I just mentioned. A little bit more on herbicides. And I'll point out, as we roll towards having literature review, there are some meta-analyses done to help us understand the effectiveness of these post-fire management actions. We know a little bit about the gradient of different post to pre-emergent herbicides. Rimsulfuron, for example, very short-lived. It's really inadequate. It has a lot of post-emergent activity. Imazapic, which is the workhorse, applied by far more than any other herbicide, has a little bit more longevity, a little bit more pre-emergent activity. The new player on the street is Rejuva. It's the commercial name, Indaziflam. And we're hoping that it's going to have the greater longevity that we're told that it does have. And actually, the preliminary experiments show that to be true. So things are changing in terms of our ability to have tools that work, herbicides that can keep exotic annual grasses suppressed long enough for the desirable perennials to recover and provide resistance. Bioherbicides, biocontrol like weed suppressive bacteria, a lot of literature suggests that they're not effective. How do you combine?
You've got about 30 seconds, Matt.
Okay, thanks. How do you combine these different agents? Not trivial. Herbicides can damage your seeds. I'll just point to a couple different topics on this that are occurring within focal landscapes and across the whole Great Basin. A lot of research on this. Also on the recovery of biological crusts, major thing that we're just learning about. Herbicides releasing biological crusts instead of suppressing them. A lot of new research on seed technologies has come out that are, again, are improving our skill. The last thing I want to point to is fuel breaks, protecting the investment. These are critical for helping prevent reburning. Everything I've talked about now is about getting green perennials back on the landscape and reducing exotic annuals. The fuel breaks are being installed on burned areas commonly now to help reduce reburning. And so for those of you that are able to review this talk, I'm providing a summary of the major points here, how we can deal with these burned areas. The key thing is that we had to put management strategies on the landscape before we fully understood how they work and how the systems work. We can use adaptive management studies on actual treatments to help put the science ahead of the management. In other words, put the horse out in front of the cart. Thank you.
All right, great, Matthew. Thank you very much for that great presentation. And your email is up there for folks that want to send you a question. Let's move on to our fifth presenter, Greg Eckert, he's an ecologist with the National Park Service, and he'll be talking about integrating invasive plant management into fire management plans. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes,
Yep,
it looks
looks
great.
good.
Okay, thanks. I had a little bit of glitch there. All right. Okay, thanks. These have been great talks. This, as you're aware, this special session has demonstrated how invasive plants and fire are intertwined, such as bufflegrass having invaded and degraded this native saguaro community in Arizona and completely altered the fire regime there. We also recognize that climate change is challenging our understanding of these interactions. So here we see the soil burn severity map from the KNP complex fire, which is still burning in California, and the uncharacteristic burn severity in giant sequoia stands related to that fire. The science being presented this week helps us understand these interactions. In this talk, I'm presenting some thoughts on how we can integrate both fire and invasive plant management on the ground. This was prompted by approaches we used over a dozen years ago. Thanks, Matt Brooks, for reminding me how long I've been doing this. To where we were trying to get both fire, natural resource, and cultural resource staff in national parks to work together on certain fire management issues. So I'm going to begin with a very generic assessment of program structure in the Park Service. And here we see that at the national level, natural resources and fire are separated administratively. And Bureau funding, so we'll come down through the national office. It goes through regional offices. In the case of fire, you see a connection of going through the regional office where you do have dedicated staff to fire modules, which will serve a number of parks. And on the natural resource side, a similar setup for governance, but it's a little less structured, hence the differences in those thicknesses of the arrows there to show the pathways in terms of the strength of the connection that reflects the policy, people following similar policies, the accountability, and basic program structure. With natural resources, funds briefly go through a regional office out to 17 invasive plant management teams, which will then serve parks on an eco-regional basis. Now, of course, we got the parks, and within the fire program, fire will also move money directly down to parks, again, through the regional program. But this is where parks are either large enough or have significant fire issues where they can warrant their own staff and things like that. In terms of invasive management, parks also apply their own budgets, so they will be doing work, but in some cases, smaller parks don't have any budget, so the invasive plant teams or IPMTs are doing just about all the invasives work, but they're only there a couple weeks of the year if they're lucky. In other cases, they're complementing work done by parks. And of course, if you're not familiar with the Park Service, all those little diagrams there for parks indicate that they are all unique, and so there's always a challenge of figuring out priorities for each from unit to unit. Okay, so how do we go about promoting invasive plant wildland fire coordination? So almost embarrassing to have put this talk together and then pretty much say that well, what we did is we had a meeting. So recently, and it's just serendipitous that came with the timing of some of the WFLIC NISC paper coming out and the this conference, but we had scheduled a meeting we have every few years between the national leadership of wildland fire and natural resources. So we actually did dedicate a session to invasive plants and fire, and we did follow the structure of the NISC WFLIC paper. Although we did find that people rarely stuck to one category to another. We kept moving across categories, which is kind of telling and informative. So these are just some examples of what ideas we came up with in terms of, and there are many more, but the gist was, we had short sessions, about an hour and a half, to talk about some of things like this, with the idea that we turn this into a 3 to 5 year plan to show how we're going to collaborate between natural resources and the fire program. So that's all great if we're, as you can see at the top of the diagram, we're now seeing the world together, seeing some things we can do at the national level. The challenge will be, how do we move this down to the ground level, to the parks themselves? So besides, and I'm really liking Lindy's talk and figuring out how we have to merge some of these ideas at different levels of organizational management. But, absent, strong direction from higher levels of the Interior Department, from the Park Service, to figure out how to get these programs to work together, our next vehicle would be the planning structure. Not the title of the talk focused on FMPs, fire management plans. It doesn't have to be limited to that, but there's generally more structure and consistency in terms of fire management plans being developed and evaluated every year. So a tool we can use in planning is a goal hierarchy. And in this case, you'd see that each of the programs would have their own goals, but a trick you can use is say, well, let's lay these things out. If you've got the structure of your overall mission, your goals, some goals, because you've got smaller components of a program or something like that. And then you have your objectives, right? What we're going to get done in a certain amount of time. So as you can see here, though, that something's missing. We see that there are disconnects between what programs are prioritizing, although each of the respective managers can actually say, well, we're working towards achieving that Park Service mission. So what is missing is a common understanding of what success looks like if we achieve those goals. And without this, it's really hard to actually justify any of our actions. So the tool we've played with before, and it's still relevant, even in rapidly changing environments and things like that, is the concept of a desired condition. And I'm sorry, lost my track here. It's preferably, so desired conditions in terms of being laid out in a clearly measurable picture and understanding of the resources once we achieve the goals. So other terms for this are end outcomes, restoration targets, management targets, things like that. And I want to remind folks that the desired conditions, because people still get wrapped up in, well, we want that, we want that pristine concept of nature. That's our desired outcome, right? Well, no, we have to include things like the institutional dimension, which is for Park Service for sure. Is why is the park a park, right? So some are dedicated for historic events. Some are recreation areas and things like that. We also have to follow other laws like the Endangered Species Act and acknowledge the capacity we have. We're working harder at bringing in the human dimensions to our management planning. And what's missing in this slide is really an indication that all of these little influences or these dimensions are being greatly influenced by climate change and other global stressors. Okay, the other thing to point out with pulling the concept of desired condition out of that goal hierarchy is that we are good at writing goals in terms of statements of intent. We want to improve the forest condition, but we're not very good at saying to what. So hence the idea of putting that desired condition idea in between the goals that we write and then the objectives that we go and write. So people will seen this too much recently, and as parks have been doing kind of sort of high level strategic planning for natural resources. But again, good at writing the goals, but not focusing too much on why and what things we're truly trying to get to, other than trying to put down, like, these are the tasks, these are the objectives we tend to do all the time, but are we really reflecting on what we're trying to get to and how we're going to get there? Okay, so another tool we could think about in terms of integration would be to take that agreed to. So if we can get folks to agree to a common desired outcome, then we get back and look at that goal hierarchy and say, well, what if we put this in the context of restoration? So, you know, you've got invasive plants here, you've got a degraded site. So let's say our goal is to restore this. And that way we could fine tune our sub goals and then really think about the actions that each of the program areas would take that would reflect a restoration outcome. And then everybody would actually be working towards a similar end game there. So that's all well and good. I'm a restoration ecologist. I straddle the invasive plant world and the fire world. So I'm all over that. But, you know, those are things we can talk about, but the nitty gritty is about helping park managers or some of our technical staff really have a systematic approach for developing a quantitative or measurable desired outcome. So an approach we work with is in ecological integrity, and as described as the condition where ecological system supports and maintains a community of organisms that has biotic composition, diversity, functional organization comparable to those of natural habitats within a region. So we actually have a project now working with NatureServe, who we worked with to help develop this guidance. It's actually, you know, Park Service worked with NatureServe to develop some of these ideas, but it's stuff that Nature Conservancy, the state heritage programs, a number of federal agencies have also adopted in terms of, you know, moving us away from just a concept, kind of a vague concept of natural and, you know, lack of human dominance, which is what the Park Service natural resource policies define it as, to something that's more metric based and has a clear logic flow in terms of how we're using our science. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is actually figure out how do we go out and characterize a site, or, you know, it could be a site, it could be a focus on a plant community type, or even a species, right? So these next set of busy slides from NatureServe's website indicate that we can work with just general descriptions. We can talk about key processes and interactions. Obviously, the characteristics of fire regimes fit in here. And then also we are working in some of the climate modeling that NatureServe and other groups have been using. And to do that, and then how do we make that into something real? So we start building up this, this framework for taking the concept of integrity, boil it down to, you know, more tangible things like, okay, how do we identify the focal resources? What are the major attributes of those things, those aspects of a resource that really drive the function of the resource? We use three broad ones called landscape context, condition, and then size, but then break them out into more specific types of attributes that fit that particular ecosystem or area in a park. So that can include, in this case, landscape structure, landscape dynamics. After that, we do want to develop indicators from which we then can attach to some value related to the quality of a site. So A quality being really good condition, and this is, B would be, you know, good, C is getting near a threshold, D is like in really bad shape. And this is probably nothing new for a lot of the ecologists and managers in the room. You've seen this kind of thing before. NatureServe, I've just always liked the way they built the logic flow with this. But the point is that we don't have this kind of structure in our planning right now. But it would be the thing that we could say, here are all the tools we have, here's the data we have that we could use to say, here's how we're getting to that common picture and putting some real tangible descriptions together.
Greg, you've got about 30 seconds to go.
Okay, the other important part then is to look at the range of variation. And then we can, again, put together a little report card, move it into that. Other tools include scenario planning. We just did a training for fire planners in Northern California this year to institute that. We want to continue to promote adaptive management. And then I've been cut off. And I just lost my, there we go. So next steps are really to work with the NIFLIC projects and build a fire management plan case study And we will be trying some of this at a case study with Kings Mountain this spring. Lastly, we got to recognize our current program disconnects and then kind of work through those kinds of tools that really help us see the world together. But the other thoughts I came up with in doing this is that FMPs aren't necessarily the answer. We got to think about integration at higher levels and then recognize the inevitable, right? I think the parks that had the big fires this past year will really see that we have to start thinking differently about how we're managing our programs. And with that, I will cut it off. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome, Greg. That's a great way to end that. Fantastic presentation. So now we'll move right on to our last presenter, Mike Zupko, Executive Director of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. And Mike will basically wrap up this session with a summary and next steps. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Zach. We really got to stop meeting this way on Zoom, but it's good to see you nonetheless.
Good to see you too.
I'll just say, everybody, hang on. I've got 5 minutes to do a quick wrap up and talk about next steps. So this is going to be fast, but kind of move forward. There we go. What was our learning journey for the past couple of days? We essentially had 3 sessions with multiple subsessions in them or multiple presentations in them. I'm going to go through this real quick for those that weren't able to make all the sessions. We started off yesterday with Stas doing an overview, talking about some of this joint work between the National Invasive Species Council and the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. I'll talk a little bit more about that in about 2 minutes. We had Matt Brooks kick us off with how wildfire promotes invasive plants. A great primer for the entire session. D'Antonio talked about longer fire seasons directly correlated to increase in human ignitions was one of the key things I learned there. Posed the question, do invasives introduce an entirely new type of disturbance? I think we learned yes. And then talked about some of the data gaps, which was interesting and is also one of the challenges I think we all realize. Ricardo talked about non-native invasive plants, the positive and negative impacts to fire, impacts to wildland fire and prescribed fire. Also talked about the impacts to ecosystem services and smoke composition. Voigt talked about learning about control mechanisms, including prescribed fire, and that timing is extremely important. Shinneman talked about, then we moved into some of the eco-regional examples. Shinneman talked about North American deserts. Simstad talked about grassland ecosystems. And one of the examples made the statement, we took away fire from the system, created a lot of the challenges there. Kearns talk about Northwestern forests and introducing fire as a new process. And then Norman talked about the Eastern landscape, said massive invasives pool in the East, and being from the East, I understand that. He talked about how invasives can impact fire and how fire can affect the pattern of invasives. And then today we talked about the interrelationships of invasives with wildfire management. Chris kicked us off talking about altered fire regimes due to the spread of non-native grasses. And then we've hit on it a couple times, but media tends to focus on forest fires, which drives public perception, which also impacts funding and policy. I think that was a really big message there. Garner talked about a strategy of how to slow the spread and how to limit fuel. Rangeland, significant risk to annual grasses and the loss of economic resources. Dickman talked about suppression tactics on invasives. I thought some of those schematics, as simple as they were awesome. I learned a lot there. Talked about operational impacts and where to look for invasive plants and fire. Germino talked about post-fire management of grasses, the diversity of invaders, and that intervention can carry its own risks, and thinking about that. And then Eckert just wrapped us up talking about integrating invasive plant management into fire management plans. And the biggest thing I learned there, and Greg, I'll have to follow up with you, is the relationship of that to chocolate. You didn't talk about that, but I saw it on your slide. No, he talked about some great action items stemming from a recent leadership meeting, how to get that into the planning structure, and how desired conditions, can really play a role. And again, I want to thank Matt Brooks for pulling this together. So where do we go from here? In the short term, again, it was talked about several times, but this partnership between NISC and WFLIC, I think is going to be huge in carrying some of these joint opportunities forward. In the short term, we'll be meeting with our leadership, Stas and I, in the next month or so to carry the proposal forward and then begin to work it out from there, working with other partners outside of federal government, states, and others. And then Joint Fire Circle, I'll wrap up with that in just a second. And then longer term, how do we continue to utilize this relationship between NISC and WFLC? How can we leverage federal actions? How can we enhance collaboration, especially with non-federal partners? One of the presentations today built out a lot of what Western Governors Association has done. Of course, Nature Conservancy has done a lot in this area, as well as other partners. The State of Science Review, that'll be my last slide here in a second, Zach, so we should be good. Talk about that. And then leadership insight into policy needs. I put it under longer term, it's really shorter term. The infrastructure funding, there's some incredible opportunities there that we can collectively move forward. And not to get into specifics, but hopefully folks are thinking about that and thinking about next steps and how we can best utilize that funding. How do I get my slide? There we go. So last thing I want to mention, I know it was mentioned a couple different times, a really unique opportunity tomorrow afternoon, or Eastern time at least, from 1 to 2:40 around the Joint Fire Circle. Matt's been working with all these authors or all these presenters in pulling together a book. And we really want your input on looking at the information needs for the management of fire and invasive species. You can see the three parts of the three larger chapters, but within each one of those parts will be multiple chapters kind of related to the presentations that we've seen today. So join us tomorrow. It's going to be a great conversation. We really want to hear more from y'all than for us, and we think about that structure. So Zach, with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike, so much for that. And yeah, if you could find a way to slide us a couple $100 million for some CCC fire invasive teams, let's talk about that. Nationwide, provide jobs, all that.
I like it. I like it.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you to all the presenters for such great presentations, and Mary Elizabeth behind the scenes making it all work smoothly. This was really great. So Mary, I will hand this back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Zachary. And thanks to all of our speakers today for sharing your expertise with us. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a 20-minute break before our next round of breakout sessions begin at the top of the hour. Choose from our second virtual field trip, 5 special sessions, and 1 general session. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the Agenda tab to the left of your screen. Click Sessions and click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Ecosystem Services. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.